Hello, this is an additional supplement along as a sort of a follow-on from the previous podcast I made around analysing myths. For this, we're going to have a look at a couple of theorists that you might want to include. A chap called Kenneth Burke and a Russian called, if I've pronounced his first name correctly, Tzvetan Todorov. Their ideas, I think you might find useful. It does depend on which myth you're doing, of course, as to whether you find it useful or not, but perhaps to consider them. Both these chaps develop their ideas in respect to things like film analysis, analysing novels, analysing stage plays, and to some extent looking at political speeches, rather than mythology and religious stories specifically. So not everything they've got to say is overtly relevant to mythology, but some of it might be, so we'll go over some of their concepts and ideas. So we'll start with Todorov. One part of his theory that is, I think, particularly more relevant is his 5 stages of story analysis, in which he says that many, and by no means all, but many stories follow a 5-stage pattern, and you can look at incidents from that story as fitting that pattern. So, there we go. That's the 5 stages he talks about. Equilibrium, disruption, recognition, repair, and new order. So when he's talking about these various different phases, it starts with equilibrium. The argument he makes is that many stories at the beginning of the story, everything is okay, everything's happy, everything is good in the world. Think, for example, not as obviously an example of a Chinese or a Japanese myth, but within Christianity and Judaism, you've got the story of the Garden of Eden. So everything is in a state of equilibrium there. Everything is good, everything is happy to begin with. Then moves to stage 2, a stage of disruption, where he says an event will happen early on in the story, which throws everything into disarray. So a murder, warfare, an act of betrayal, some kind of horrible event goes on and everything is thrown up in the air. And the characters got to get used to this. I say characters, obviously that's how he's talking about films and books rather than religious imagery. The third stage, recognition, is when the leading figures, the good guys, if you like, within the story, they realise what's happened. They see what murder, warfare, what awful event has gone on. So in the story of the Last Supper, it's when Jesus realises that, and the others realise that Judas is the traitor, has betrayed them. So the act of betrayal is the disruption. When they all find out and they go, "Oh my God, what have you done?" That's the act of recognition. Or if you want to put it in more secular terms, and Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot, and Miss Marple, the murder is the disruption, the recognition is when they find the corpse and realise the murder has taken place, and everyone goes, "Oh, what do we do now?" So if you're looking at the kind of myth that begins happy, then moves to some big traumatic event, you could explain what that event is, using Todorov's theory as a sort of a framework. Then go on to recognition. When do the other characters, the main characters, find out about this big disruptive event? A minute later, a year later, whenever. They find out what's happened. That then moves the story into phase 4, which is the repair phase, where the good guys are trying to put right whatever has gone wrong. So they're trying to end the war. If there's been a murder, they're trying to find the person who committed the murder, that sort of thing. There is an attempt to put right what has gone wrong. So to use an example from Egyptian mythology, with the murder of Osiris, the repair phase is when Isis is trying to find his body in order to work her magic, to bring him back to life, to put him back to the way it was. That brings us to the final phase, phase 5, the new order. In some stories, the new order is cyclical, and it goes back to the beginning. Everything goes back to the way it was at the start of the story. The war is over, everyone is peaceful again, something in that vein. There are, however, some stories in which it cannot go back. So Isis is trying to put the story, and a living husband at the start, then he's murdered, and she tries to bring him back to life. She's trying to put it back to the original format, but of course her brother, the murderer, Setech, appears out of nowhere and chops the body into 14 pieces before she can resurrect it. So he ruins the plan. And so instead of restoring to original factory settings, the story ends by the creation of a new order out of the remains of the old order. So at the end of that Egyptian story, Isis and her son Horus take on board the rulership of Egypt. They can't bring the husband back from the dead, but they can still restore order in a slightly different way. So you might have a story which either ends by everything goes back to the beginning, or you have a story in which they can't do that, but they make the best of a bad job, and they bring about the best order they can out of the chaos that everything has been thrown into. So that's one to look at. Now, a related idea is from Kenneth Burke, who has three phases rather than 5. That's the 3 phases: pollution or guilt, purification, and finally redemption. And again, he's not saying every single story fits this mould, just that a lot fit this mould. We have mentioned Kenneth Burke in the first year, but you might have forgotten him by now. We looked at his dramaturgical theory, but that bit of his theory isn't particularly relevant to what you're doing for this presentation. So the pollution part, you begin the story with a character who has either done something very, very wrong themselves, they've committed some terrible, terrible act, or they have allowed a terrible act to take place on their watch. In either direction, there is a sense of guilt for what has been done wrong. Burke, at one point in one of his many books, talks about how politicians sometimes use this as a narrative. So it's not just novels and films, it's political fiction as well. So to give you a grim example, Hitler, back in the day when he was giving his speeches, argued that everything had gone wrong in German society, not because of the Germans themselves, but because of the Jews, the Gypsies, all these other groups that they couldn't stand, who had done wrong things. And the fault was with the Germans allowing it, permitting it. They had to put right what somebody else had done wrong because they'd allowed them to do it wrong in the first place. So that's an example of how it can either be a direct act or an indirect allowance of wrongdoing. Purification is where there is a striving to put right, again, that very like the repair phase of Todorov's theory. They are trying to put right what has been done wrong, to cleanse the stain on character, on their soul, on society, or whatever it may be. So to give you an example, from Japanese myth, I think you're both doing Chinese myth, so hopefully this won't kind of intrude on what you were planning to do. In Japanese myth, you've got the 2 creator deities, the 2 main deities, Izanagi and his wife Izanami. As the story goes on, everyone's happy to start with, but the story goes on, Izanami gets pregnant, she gives birth, but she dies whilst giving birth. And her husband, Izanagi, is so grief-stricken by the death of his wife that he kills the child she has given birth to. That's the guilt, the sin, the pollution, the murder, and so on. And, well, long story short, there's a bit of a hoo-ha, and eventually he decides he's got to retrieve his wife from the underworld. Common theme in quite a lot of myths and stories of the need that someone's died and the husband, the wife, the mother, the father, whoever it is, has got to go down into the underworld to find them. So this is a Japanese variation of that. So he goes into Yomi, the land of the dead, and he finds his wife, and he's expecting it all to be lovely and, you know, mills and boon and a big reunion. But there she is as this wretched, decaying, almost like a kind of a zombie sort of goddess. Bits of her dropping off all over the place, and he can't bear to be near. She's so shocking and awful and terrible that he legs it back to the afterlife, and has to perform back to the land of the living, rather, and has to perform acts of ritual purification, washing, and all sorts of other things he has to do with the Misagi rite, the rite of purification, which itself helps to create more gods in the act of purification, just as his murder of his own newborn child, that, as blood was flowing here and there and everywhere, that helped create a whole raft of other deities. So it's a creation myth as well as a myth of purification. The redemption phase, that last bit, is the creation of the other gods, the act of purification, the fact that the world comes into existence including the grim bad bits like the land of the dead, the land of decay and death, as a result of all of this going on. So it could be that the myth you're looking at has a bad act, a phase of purification, and eventual redemption of those who have done the bad thing. And you could use Burke's structure to explain this bit of the story is that bit of the story is that bit of the story is the third phase, etc. We did mention Joseph Campbell in the other podcast, so I'm not going to bang on and on and on about him. But just as a very short recap of certain points that overlap here, he said there are 4 main functions of mythology. It can be metaphysical, cosmological, sociological, or pedagogical. That word. Sorry. The metaphysical is describing the sense of awe, the sense of wonder, the sense of amazement that comes with life, the sense of how fabulous everything can be. It's inspiring people with a sense of wonder and a sense of just things being transcendent, being amazing. The cosmological is explaining why the universe is the way it is. And I should say, just to recap, not all myths do all 4 things. Some myths do 1 only, some myths do a combination of 2 or a combination of 3. Very rarely you get a myth that does all 4. The cosmological, so why is the world the way it is? And you could say that Japanese myth I've just mentioned, isn't it, is, this is the land of the dead, that's down there, this is the land of the living, that's over here. Well, these gods, they existed because this happened, those gods exist because that happened. So that's a bit of cosmological explanation of why the world is the shape it is. The sociological is picked up on here in that the sociological function of myth is the story justifies why people do what they do in society, the rites, the rituals, the habits, the customs. Why do men marry women and women marry men? Why do you have to bury the dead in this way, or cremate them, or do whatever you have to do? Why do we have to do the things we have to do? So the myth justifies it, says this is how it started. It has to be like this because this is what the gods want. And you can't argue with gods because they get annoyed. And the last thing you want is an annoyed god. So you could say this is a Japanese myth is a justification for the mizogi purification ceremonies. This is why we have to purify ourselves. Plus saying contact with a corpse, the dead goddess, is something that requires you to be purified. Therefore, most people should avoid contacting a body, touching a body if they can possibly avoid it. And if their job as a police officer or a pathologist or something requires them to touch dead bodies a lot, these are the rituals they should do afterwards to cleanse themselves before they go back into mainstream society. So it's justifying social custom. The last function, the pedagogical one, is teaching people something. It's saying this is how to live a good life. This is what you should do to be a good, decent person. I suppose you could argue that there is an element of that in that Japanese myth, in that when his wife dies, his response is to murder the child. It's a theme you get in A Christmas Carol with Scrooge, and he doesn't like his nephew because his own sister died giving birth to the nephew. It's blaming the child for something beyond the child's capacity to control. It is not the fault of the child that the mother died in childbirth. So to punish the child by killing them or making their life a misery is a wicked thing to do. So it's saying this is what not to do. Do not punish your child if your wife dies in childbirth. And obviously, further we go back in history, the more and more numbers of women died giving birth to their children. And so it would have been a probably fairly common experience for a man to have at least one, if not several, children whose mothers, multiple marriages and so on, whose mothers had died in the act of giving birth to them. And it's the whole kind of how do you relate to a child if you're still grieving for the woman who died bringing that child into the world. And there's sort of elements of instruction, of teaching, of almost like a kind of form of psychotherapy, I suppose you could argue, that it's giving a bit of agony aunt advice. If this terrible thing happens to you in this life, try not to behave in this way, try to behave in that way. So you could say the myth is doing a little bit of that. So even if the myths you're looking at don't really fit either Todorov or Fisher. Perhaps some of the elements of Campbell might be more relevant there. So you could say, well, this myth is serving this purpose, and then obviously if you give a bit of a justification for why you think it is serving that purpose, then that will get you a few extra points in the grade marking, and then bump it up a bit. So you could kind of build on that and explain that. Hopefully this is vaguely useful and will give you a few extra ideas to sort of squeeze in. But any questions you have, email me before the presentation and I'll give you a bit of extra advice. Okay, thank you.